Displacement is the humanitarian challenge of the 21st century. In 2020, the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees announced that every 2 seconds someone in the world is displaced from their home. According to the UNHCR's figure, to June 2021, there were 82.4 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, from which almost 60% are internal displaced populations. The human crisis of forced displacement has contributed to the accelerated emergence of marginal settlements with new forms of forced urbanization that are often not officially recognized due to the lack of formality, making these territories politically, economically, socially, and culturally invisible places. Today, more than 1 billion people live in these settlements in developing countries. Currently, Colombia is the largest contributor of internal displacement in the world, with more than 8.1 million. This represents perhaps the largest cumulative humanitarian challenge the country has to date. Considering that its current total population goes a little beyond 50 million, and that in cities like Medellin, 1 of every 5 inhabitants is a forced internally displaced person, or IDP in short. In Colombia, the continuous waves of rural-urban migration that have taken place since the mid-20th century have contributed substantially to the formation of marginal settlements. Initially, Colombia's main cities were seen as attractive destinations for rural populations who saw how their life in their countryside didn't fulfill their economic expectations, while the growth of industrialization in cities was more promising for them. From the early 1990s, with the intensification of armed conflict in the country's rural areas, cities passed from being a socioeconomic option to a survival refuge for these migrants. In this way, the large exodus of farming populations into cities started an overgrowth urbanization process, resulting in the emergence and ongoing formations of barrios populares in Medellin. What makes urbanization invisible, and what does it mean for its community? Let us explore how invisible territories emerge systematically in cities in the developing world as exercise of power relations in spatial production. This has widening exclusion and inequalities. However, tools such as participatory mapping will help to empower invisibilized communities, increasing local capability and informing policymakers and local authorities for more assertive decisions when they design housing solutions for IDPs. The United Nations Development Programme defines invisible inhabited territories as settlements generally located in urban peripheries, forming the so-called poverty belts that are especially socioeconomically and functionally segregated. That is, they lack public services, basic sanitation, road infrastructure, connectivity, green areas, public space, health and education services, that are far from the productive and commercial centers. In other words, marginalized territories. In Medellin, and likely in many other cities of the global south, the lack of territorial and legal recognition of new marginal settlements, invisible territories, had generated an argumentative dichotomy of the advantages of being either visible or invisible. When IDPs resettle in the city, they face new imposed sociocultural, political, and economic conditions that they do not necessarily always wish for recognition due to the disadvantages that inflicted legitimization could bring to the freedom of informality. For instance, taxation, bills, surveillance. The rapid urbanization that the global south is experiencing for causes such as conflict and climate change increases the emergent speed of invisible territories and the challenge for local governments to adapt and respond to them. This includes the recent highly dependency of information technology, tools by governments for decision making which could emancipate sociospatial exclusion and injustice for the most vulnerable. For instance, when a territory has the tag of invisible, it means that they can disappear from the eyes of decision makers when allocating resources such as infrastructure and social welfare. In some ways, it shows that the entire technology dependence of urban planning will, unless alternative action is taken, perpetuate invisibility and therefore inequalities. Recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has visibilized aspects such as the interdependence between visible and invisible urban economies. In Colombia, when national and local governments decide to reopen only some of the formal economic sectors for economic recovery, immediately those sectors face constraints on the commercialization of goods, which is supported in great part by informal vendors who were not allowed to leave their houses. This situation generated massive protests in Colombia due to the incapability of the state to manage the economic crisis and the precarious living conditions of these communities. But more important, this incident displayed a revealing reality in the daily news bulletins. The visible and invisible territories are also mutually dependent. The politics of invisibility capitalize in homogenizing policies are permeated by the patterns of capitalist urbanization. For instance, standardized urban planning policies, even following good intentions, such as massive housing solutions for the poor, brings a high risk of losing sociospatial and cultural identity. Homogeneous high-rise social housing buildings have been implemented as devices of superficial visibility. Low-income housing has been commodified, their planning process have not been participatory, and their locations on the urban edges remain marginal. These imposed housing solutions seek to comply with the political agenda free of affordable housing for the poor. In this sense, it is no urbanization, but the modes of urbanization that promote invisibility. In this sense, policymakers should address housing for displaced communities not as a merely architectural artifact, nor from a lucrative perspective. Housing for IDPs should be addressed from an acculturative approach. For this recognition, legitimization, sociospatial, and sociocultural integration are key factors to visibilize and promote inclusion in urban contexts of forced displacement and resettlement. Contesting standardization and invisibility is a fight not to achieve equality, but rather to get recognition. Equality homogenizes, but recognition diversifies. Rapid urbanization is not homogeneous, and urban heterogeneity needs to be recognized along with the mutually dependency of the formal and informal dimensions of cities. In this way, cities could overcome the current mutually exclusive relationship between participation and visibility. Addressing the systematic formation of marginal settlements as a form of forced urbanization resulting from politics of invisibility will be a good starting point for leaving no one behind, as proclaimed by the United Nations in order to achieve more sustainable cities.